So I'm very happy to be a part of this panel because in some ways the young people who are up here are the reason it made sense to do this reunion of sorts, to do this reflection, and the work that they're doing is so inspiring. Marcellus Blount earlier said, he had the privilege of learning from his students, and I feel, as an activist, I don't say necessarily I'm an elder, but I'm an older activist, and organizer, and I really always feel so inspired and learn so much when I listen to young people who are doing this work and seeing it all through a different lens. So we don't see it as a older activist telling younger activists what to do, but an exchange across generation. So again, I'm Barbara Ransby. I was a student here a long time ago, 30 years ago, was involved in the anti-apartheid work here, the divestment struggle. I'm a historian now at University of Illinois. And I just want to again thank IRAAS, thank Sam Roberts and his team for hosting and making this conversation possible, and certainly all my friends and colleagues who were on the earlier panel. So by way of introduction, we want to start with this panel, and we're going to let people do self-introductions to say a little bit about your work around divestment, your when and where and how a little bit, and then we'll come back to some questions. And Tanaquil had suggested we start with two of the questions from the last panel, which was Whitney's question about personal commitment and how one sustains yourself when it's lonely, when you don't have a large mass of followers, a large base. And then Daniel's question about sustainability. How do students manage to continue to be students? How do those of us who are parents continue to be parents and do this work for the long haul? And I think I'm interested in the answers to those questions because I'm not sure I have perfect answers either. But join me in welcoming this panel. And we'll start with Whitney Tymas to do the introductions across.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks, everybody. I'm Whitney Tymas. I was a student here at Columbia during the time of the, thank you, during the time of the blockade and the events surrounding and following the blockade. I was on the steering committee of the Coalition for Free South Africa, went on to go to law school. I've been a lawyer for now 25 years. Most of my work at this point focuses on racial justice within the criminal justice system.
And you were at Barnard.
Yes, and I was a Barnard student. Hey, Kenny, another of our esteemed faculty members, wonderful.
Cohort of Eric
and
Hirsch.
Cohort, that's right. Anyway, let me pass the mic on. Thank you.
But could you dwell on Barnard for a minute?
Yes, yes. Yeah. Okay, so one of the things that it's important to keep in mind about the campus at that time was that Columbia College was just becoming co-ed. So Barnard College and Columbia College were really, Barnard College was the women's undergraduate institution that was the companion to Columbia College. And then there were also women on campus at GS, at General Studies, and throughout other different schools within the university. But at the undergraduate level for full-time students, Barnard College was primarily where the women were. There were equal numbers of women involved in the anti-apartheid struggle as men, and so there really, for practical purposes, there really wasn't a distinction between Barnard College and Columbia College. However, of course, institutionally, there was a big distinction in terms of who the trustees were, who the players were running the institutions, but for the purposes of organizing students, there wasn't a distinction. And so when the time came for Barnard students to really think about taking the momentum of the movement in front that was physically manifested in front of Hamilton Hall to Barnard, that led to a separate sequence of discussions with a separate administration. And so there did come a time, I don't know if I should get into this here, if do you all want to hear, we can circle back around to it, but there did come a time when there were separate discussions with the Barnard administration, specifically with the president of Barnard, Ellen Futter. And so there were women, and actually there were no men present in those conversations. It was a set of conversations with Barnard women and the Barnard administration that ultimately led to Barnard's divestment. So, thanks.
Okay, my name is Tanaquil Jones, and I'm a graduate of the School of General Studies. I was involved in the Coalition for Free Southern Africa. I was part of the steering committee. Prior to being on the steering committee, I was a supporter who attended the meetings, and subsequently I was one of the co-chairs of Concerned Black Students at Columbia University. Since I've graduated from Columbia, I have been involved in a number of legal organizations and organizations that supported tenants' rights, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered individuals, and also I am currently a delegate of the UFT and a math teacher in the New York City school system.
Hi everybody, my name is Imani Brown. I graduated from Columbia last year, May 2014, and while I was on campus, I was mostly involved with the Caribbean Students Association, Students Against Mass Incarceration, and then finally in my last year, Columbia Prison Divest, which kind of was sort of an initiative of Students Against Mass Incarceration. You know, I think a lot of, me coming into that work was sort of finding a community on campus through the IRC, the Intercultural Resource Center, which is actually a space that was fought for and won by sort of the struggles of students around this time period. So thank you very much, because, you know, based on the conversations that happen around students of color feeling safe, on this campus, we got a space where I can say, like, was a refuge for me at a lot of different moments during my time in school. So.
Yeah, I pretty much introduced myself before, but I was co-chair with Danny Armstrong of the Coalition for Free South Africa on campus in the early 80s. I left Columbia in 84 and continued to do anti-apartheid work, and later worked with African American women in defense of ourselves in the Black Radical Congress and the Baker Mandela Center at University of Michigan, and now I direct the Social Justice Initiative at University of Illinois, where I also teach.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Dooney. I organize with Columbia Prison Divest, and I have for like the last, since last semester. Can you hear me?
You might have to speak up, Ted.
I'm sorry.
This doesn't amplify. This is just for the, so you have to amplify.
I did not know that.
You
okay.
have to be the amplifier.
Right. And I've been working mostly on political education, media, and then working with our allies at Students for Justice in Palestine for divestment from G4S.
Hi, I'm Ella Every-Wortman. I'm a junior in CC, and I've been organizing with Columbia Prison Divest since the fall semester. I got involved with Columbia Prison Divest, I think, because there's a lot of, I guess it was a campaign where I could see my own complicity. I like that Columbia Prison Divest is about getting students to recognize that there are these big systems of injustice in the world. And we as Columbia students are invested in them, and we have a responsibility to hold our institution accountable to that. So that's why I got involved.
Okay. So we had said we were going to do this larger question of sustainability and also balancing being a student or whatever other identities we have and lives we have with our activism. But I think what we need to do first actually is get on the table what the current Columbia Divest campaigns are about. So let me ask you all to tell us what you've been doing. And I know Columbia Divest is a big umbrella, and under it is primarily, you've been working on prison divest. There's also boycott, divestment, sanctions efforts among the Palestinian students, which you all are in solidarity with. So tell us about Columbia Divest 2015.
Do you want to give like an overview of how it started, maybe?
Yeah, so I can kind of give a little bit of an overview of how it started, and you know, I know less about, you know, where we are now, so I'll hand it off after that. But basically, Students Against Mass Incarceration was a group that was started at Columbia a few years ago, and it's a group that I joined around my junior year, and basically, you know, the mission is we're fighting against the mass incarceration of Black and brown people, and so what had happened was actually there was a student activist an organizer from Florida who had done a lot of this divestment work in different schools and started in her own school, right? But then was sort of traveling to different campuses to talk to people about how it would be possible to start their own campaign, right? And so she was actually the first person who got us thinking about divestment, but not necessarily from the framework of necessarily needing to know exactly what Columbia was invested in. She kind of gave us the idea, basically, that it would be simple enough to demand that they tell us that they were not invested in private prisons, right? For us to sort of launch a campaign that was based off of that. What actually ended up happening, though, was that one of our students called one of the offices and asked them for a list of investments, right, under the guise of needing it for research for her senior thesis. And she was a sophomore at the time, so, and they actually just handed it right over. And so, well, what we had seen was a list of maybe about 20% of what Columbia's actually invested in, because they have all these rules in terms of, you know, what else we can see. So we can only imagine, you know, what's on that list. But we were able to see that Columbia was invested about, I think it was $8 million or so in the CCA, the Corrections Corporation of America, which is the country's largest private prison company, right? And so based on that, we had to make some decisions about how we wanted to launch the campaign. Was it going to be a project of SAMI itself? Was it going to be a separate initiative? But basically, out of those conversations that we had in SAMI, we decided that we were going to start a campaign with some very clear demands, and talk a little bit more as we went along about how we were actually going to, the strategy we were going to put in place in order to win those. But the main demands had to do with you know, divesting immediately from the CCA, but as well as G4S, which we also have money invested in.
What that is.
And so G4S is sort of the world's largest or second largest private security company, and you know, in a lot of ways, you kind of see how mercenaries in a sort of way, because places like Israel have hired them to enforce the apartheid state that exists there now. And so we kind of wanted to make sure to establish those links early on, right? So the idea that that what's happening globally, again, like as was said in the first panel, is very connected to what's happening domestically. You can take it away.
Yeah. So this year, we've been approaching divestment as, I guess, with several goals. Like, first of all, making sure that divestment actually happens. Our goal was to have it happen by graduation this year. And so to achieve that, that meant trying to get the president of the university, Lee Bollinger, to meet with us. And so we staged several actions demanding that he meet with us, hear our concerns as the president of the university and a member of the Board of Trustees, and bring the issue of prison divestment to the Board of Trustees. And so we were able to meet with him in the fall. And then along with that, we were also working with the university's advisory committee on socially responsible investing, the ACSRI, which is basically just like a bureaucratic runaround and like distraction. Yeah, so we've been presenting to them, working with them, trying to convince them that prison divestment is necessary, and that private prisons are a toxic enough investment that the university can't possibly say that that they're socially responsible and invest in private prisons. And so just recently, the ACSRI actually voted unanimously to recommend to the Board of Trustees that they divest from CCA and G4S. So that was huge and really exciting. But along with sort of pushing for divestment, a huge part of our work has been political education and trying to raise awareness, raise the level of student consciousness about mass incarceration, both in the U.S. and the like global trend that is occurring, particularly with G4S, and also just like we are a campaign of SAMI. SAMI is like a prison abolitionist organization, and so bringing those conversations to campus as well.
I think that also our goal kind of has been to use divestment as a radical strategy and to make sure that we aren't, I think that divestment can kind of be kind of like a liberal reformist kind of thing, but it's like really crucial that we're a campaign of SAMI and that everything we do is informed by like a larger abolitionist vision. So a lot of what we've tried to do, especially this semester with Beyond the Bars that happened a couple weeks ago, is making sure that we're framing divestment as like, when it happens, hopefully soon, that's a good thing, but that the work isn't over then, and that Columbia is invested in these systems of incarceration and policing and racism in material and non-material ways. So like even as soon as they divest their money from CCA and G4S, which hopefully they do, that doesn't mean that Columbia like cares about the violence that it's doing to Black and brown people every day. So we kind of like are happy and excited about the university being responsive to our demands, but also understand that Columbia can not have shares in CCA and still be invested in mass incarceration.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you all, before we take the focus off of you, in kind of building off of Whitney's question, why this issue, why now? Why is this issue important to you? Why do you think it should be important to us? We started our earlier panel with why South Africa at that moment, but why prisons and why prison divest at this moment?
So I guess one thing that I would say is that we, you know, in SAMI, when we were talking about launching this campaign, it was always sort of with the awareness that private prisons really aren't the main driving force of mass incarceration, right? They're actually pretty much in the minority in terms of the prison system that does exist now. However, we sort of understood that like in this climate, right, where mass incarceration really is an epidemic, where you know, economic injustice is hurting our people into these police states where their bodies are hyper disposable, where, you know, and where Columbia is a driving force of that right here in Harlem, right? With that understanding, we wanted to start a larger conversation about, you know, what sort of systems it's acceptable to invest in, right? And what sort of what communities you're disinvesting in or really like launching explicit violence against, right? When you choose to invest in these companies, right? Especially with this sort of rhetoric that especially Lee Bollinger has been a huge part of in terms of affirmative action, in terms of addressing like systemic oppression. we just saw like a really big gap in terms of that rhetoric and the idea of this institution not only investing in private prisons, but also, you know, having a campus security system that's so linked to the NYPD, right? That's policing black and brown bodies in Harlem, right? And pushing them out and away. So I think for all those reasons, it kind of made sense in this moment to talk about mass incarceration through the lens of divestment from private prisons, but we always sort of had the understanding that that's not really necessarily the point. It's the framing, right? But these systems of oppression that include private prisons, that include mass incarceration, are also linked to so many other elements and systems that work to oppress brown and black people. So,
turn up your volume a little bit.
Sure. I think that also something that we talk a lot about within the campaign is like envisioning it as a point of access for a lot of students who go to this elite university to start thinking about their complicity in systems of incarceration and understanding that like the resources that we have access to here and the prestige of this university don't just come from nowhere, and that they're not only connected to but that they depend on violence against black and brown people. And so we've been trying to engage with a lot of the community that wouldn't otherwise be thinking about those things. And I think that that's also kind of like why prison divestment, and that prisons are just kind of like one way for us to engage with that. And I think that also there's kind of more of a national movement, like a national prison divestment movement going on, facilitated through Enlace, who's a group that we've been working with. And they're kind of a national organization who are working to tie organizing around mass incarceration to a movement towards like immigrant justice. So considering the ways that immigrant detention, which in so many ways parallels the prison system, how that can be tied, especially through groups like companies like Corrections Corporation of America and Geo Group, who are running immigrant detention centers and private prisons, how we can have kind of a more all-encompassing campaign to divest from both of those things.
Yeah, just echoing both of those things that were said by you all. I think we actually had an administrator say to us that like private prisons were kind of an esoteric issue. Which I thought was interesting because it's really, like both of you were saying, it's really not about the private prison industry. Divestment is like a lens for talking about racial justice, for talking about gender justice and economic justice and immigrant justice. Like all of these things are tied through the private prison industry and through the divestment campaign.
I know that some of you worked on the Manhattanville projects and the rounding up of young black and brown people in that community and kind of how Columbia was complicit in that. I don't know if you want to, going back to Estela's point earlier about connections to the community and the points people made earlier. Can anybody say anything about that?
Sure. We kind of like allied with groups that were doing work around that, but
and let people, I don't know if everybody knows
what happened.
The lay of the land.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, last June there was like a massive raid at the Manhattanville Grant projects that was, I think, called like the largest gang raid in NYPD's history. And as soon as it happened, Columbia Public Safety sent out like a celebratory email about like how proud Columbia was of the NYPD for doing this work to make the community safer, and that kind of thing. And this fall, there were a lot of court hearings for the black and brown men who had been taken to Rikers Island, and the community here tried to show up for them. The Coalition Against Gentrification and Columbia Prison Divest, we released a statement which was published online. I don't know if it's still available, but just expressing like our like disdain for Columbia's celebration of the raids, but also for making explicit a connection that we've always known exists between Columbia and the police state. But I wasn't personally involved in a lot of that organizing, but I think that a lot of it had to do with Columbia students going to those court hearings to show that we, you know, like aren't standing with the university on this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. that, you know, Columbia made a lot of promises about, you know, the different ways it was going to invest in the community when this whole Manhattanville project first got launched, that they really have not made good on in any sort of way at all. And so I think like that specifically really is a good example of just how tied Columbia is to sort of the disposability of black bodies in the area that it has occupied. And so yeah, that's an important link to make.
Okay, so before we shift to the personal commitment and sustainability question, there was a question that we had to try to link the two panels, which was to ask you all if you had any thoughts or questions or any things that stood out for you as being different or similar to the work that you're doing now. And you can direct them to Tanaquil and Whitney, who are poised to answer the most complex question that you can formulate. Just kidding. But if you saw any, if you had any questions, or if you saw any similarities or differences, or if things resonated or stood out for you about the 80s divestment campaign. You don't have to, but if you do.
Well, I think like one of the things that stood out to me was sort of kind of just how radical you guys were in I think like the decision to form the Blockade is one that for a lot of people now seems just kind of unimaginable, you know. The idea that, especially with the amount of debt that so many people go into, that you could make that such a large group of students could make the decision to possibly face expulsion and arrest and all those different types of things. And I don't know if it's a question as much as it is like just trying to think about what the different ways that the institution has sort of adjusted itself almost in response to that kind of radical action. I mean, the fact that we even have an ACSRI, right? Like that came after the South African apartheid divest movement. They said, you know what, like we care about, you know, the ethical nature of our investments, and so here's this sort of dummy group that we're going to set up to waste your time, sometimes 4 years at a time, right? The amount of time it takes, right, for a student to graduate, so that at the end of the day we can make a recommendation to the Board of Trustees that doesn't even, you know, that explicitly doesn't have any kind of direct power behind it. So, you know, just trying to think about how, like, if you had any advice for, you know, adjusting to, like, what's obviously like a response, right, to some of the work that you guys might have done, what that might look like or sound like.
Well, one thing I want to say is I'm listening to the young activists on this panel is the more things change, the more they stay the same. And whenever you make a decision to come up against a powerful entity which has tremendous resources like Columbia University, I don't know if they're now #2, but at the time they were the second largest landlord in the city of New York, that they do a lot of things to basically undermine all your movements. And one of the things I was thinking about was, you know, how when we came here recently, a bunch of us from 30 years ago, and we went to Hamilton Hall, we noticed when we were sitting outside all these cameras. And as a matter of fact, they were recording us, and somebody came outside and said, "Excuse me, do you have a permit to be on the steps of Hamilton Hall?" And, you know, I was like, well, what are you going to do, arrest us? Okay, like, okay, we could do this all over again. But it's just, you know, one of the things that you all are up against is the surveillance of the police state, which was not as sophisticated as it is now. For us, what they did were, I mean, some of the things that they did in terms of intimidation factor methods were they came out, they filmed us, they had deans come out, and because we didn't identify ourselves and they didn't know who we were, so they used personal relationships that deans had with students to say, oh, that's so-and-so, so that they could bring us up on disciplinary charges later on. I want to say that for myself, when we were arrested after one of our numerous events that we were involved in, we were taken to the precinct on 126th Street, and whose picture is up in the police precinct with a caption underneath but mine. And I'm so the close relationship between Columbia and the New York City Police Department has always been there. So I think that they engage in all of these strategies to kind of like make people think that they've changed. The issue of racism and Eurocentrism on this campus has been something that students have been fighting against probably since the 40s. So this is not a new struggle. And people are still fighting against it, and it manifests itself in different ways. Before, it used to be investments in companies doing business in South Africa. Now it's investments in companies that are involved in the prison system. So I just think that we just need to maintain our vigilance and realize that, you know, if change is going to come back around, like Estela said, you know, that there's never progress without struggle. And people have to figure out what sacrifice they're willing to make to ensure that progress happens. But it's not going to happen by itself, or because Columbia is such a benevolent institution that really cares about social justice, because they, I don't think that they really do. It's just my opinion. I don't know if Whitney wants to say.
I'll just add something very basic, okay? Thanks. So, okay, so here's a little bit of, this is going to come across as somewhat maternal, because I do have two of my kids are in the audience, and I was having a conversation with one of them before we got started about activism and really taking care of yourself. And she was just like, "Wow, Mommy, how many times have you been arrested?" I was like, "A couple." And I said, you know, don't do the things that I did just in the way that I did them, And by that I mean, when I graduated from Columbia, I was actually the first member of my immediate family to get a college diploma, and I almost didn't get it. And I realized that that was really, you know, it was kind of a close call. We might not have made it through here. And I got through here by the grace of the kindness of a whole bunch of people. There were professors here who were sympathetic, who might not have been out on the blockade with us, but who actually, I had one professor who worked with me individually, because he said, "Look, I know you were out there every day. I wasn't, but I'm going to make sure you pass my class. I'm going to help you with this paper." I didn't have my stuff together. And so I will say to the young activists here, stick to the fundamentals. If you're going to take over a building, get arrested, do things like that, make sure you have your stuff together. That means basic things: sleeping well, eating well. There are so many activists out there who do not have their personal lives straight. Now, I believe that one of the reasons that we were effective, and this isn't something that we've really gone into, it's something that Tony touched on in the video that was playing earlier. We gave each other a lot of support that I really do believe carried us through that time and allowed us to do the things that we did. So there is an importance to having the right people around you, and having and just engaging in a level of self-care that will enable you to stretch and to be successful in all areas of your life. It's not something, there isn't a handbook for activists out there where anybody's going to tell you that. But I know from experience that there are so many burnt out activists out there who do not take care of themselves. And, you know, and if you're going to be in this for the long haul, you have to take care of yourself. You got to get your exercise, eat right, sleep, and associate with the right people. Dave is cracking. It sounds so basic, but really, I mean, so much of life really is basic. And so, and just one thing, I mean, the people in the room, Tony stood up with Rob and me when we got married. Barbara called us from the hospital when she was giving birth, right after Jason was born. I mean, make sure that you have good people around you that you really trust. Laird, you know, we talk about stuff, you know, really important things. And so it's just, I can't emphasize that enough. You know, any level of disagreement that we ever had among ourselves, we dealt with it internally. You guys are not going to agree with each other all the time about things. There has to be a place where you can go, where you can set aside like all of the care about how things come out, how you say things, whether you sound right, you know, where you can really speak to each other honestly and, you know, and help each other grow. So for whatever that's worth, that was the magic sauce, I think, for us. Dave, yeah.
I actually want to ask is Asha still here?
She's not here right now.
What it was that your parents told you about what they did earlier on, and if the others on the panel, if there's anything that your parents told you or the way they raised you that might have set you apart from the other children that are out, the other kids that are out there on the steps are not in this room today, because that might help those of us that are parents to do that.
Where's the floating mic?
It's in front of you.
Right there.
The floating one? Oh, isn't there another one? No. Okay. I don't know. You're being put on the spot. Do you want to answer? You don't have to.
With our parents, I haven't laughed. I guess what I'll say to that was that it was really interesting coming to Columbia, because I think I grew up with these stories of all this like radical activism, and yeah, I'm a student now, and I think it was interesting coming to Columbia with, I had kind of like rose-colored glasses of like how, you know, great the university must be now, and we can get all this stuff done, and kind of seeing how much work there really still is to do, you know, and being aware of that. And I think it's also interesting to see how many students aren't aware of it. Like, there are a lot of us here, and I think that the pocket of those students that are aware is a little bit small. And so I think that like the work, you know, that you guys are doing about facilitating a conversation is really important. And so I guess, like, to your point about being a parent, you know, helping your kids out, is just making them aware that sometimes the conversation is where it has to start, because not everybody's coming from the same place of awareness.
Were you aware of your parents, that they were activists?
Yes.
We didn't keep it secret.
Yes.
Thanksgiving dinner or Thanksgiving?
Yeah, you know, it was, do you want to talk about that at all, or?
I think you're doing just fine.
She has to have the mic.
Yeah.
Yeah, good, no?
No, I'm good.
You're good.
Okay.
It was a pretty constant thing. It was really tied into the constant conversation of, you know, being aware of your surroundings and being aware of, you know, other people. And I really appreciate that a lot. And it was really cool because you know, we have pictures and, you know, all these things from that time. And actually, when I came for my days on campus, me and my dad were laughing because we went to Hamilton and there's now like a glass structure. And they were like, well, you know, if they ever tried to lock up the building again, they could probably break in, you know. And so, you know, that was kind of comedic, but also, you know, just speaks to kind of the, as you were talking about how the university kind of has, you know, different ways that they can do some runarounds in the response to that time. And so I think that's part of it.
Do you all want to say anything about your parents and your activism?
Because Barbara, when we met a couple of months ago, I was so, Asha was speaking, and I had no idea that she was, she was a very impressive person, and she talks about the movement, the struggles that they were doing on campus, and then, yeah, I had no idea that I was recording until the end of the meeting. So.
Yeah, we were in a meeting, and Dave said, how do you know her? Like, she's been around. She's just been around. She gets around.
You're a historian, you've done all these things, but that's one of the things you'd be most proud of is having played a role in that.
Thank you. You all gonna take a pass on the parents? You gonna give some props to the peeps?
Yeah.
Give some props to the peeps.
I think that, so I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, that's where I grew up, and I think my parents were always really Afrocentric, very much into the whole idea of Pan-Africanism in a way that is not always true for people coming from West Indian households. I think like the sort of independence narrative has in some ways obscured the history of just like racialization and the way that that works in different places. But I think, you know, integrity, I think, was something that was always just really, really underlined. Like, I think like that idea that like if you cannot make the connection between, you know, what you see happening in front of you and what you actually want the world to look like, and if you can't stick to your guns on that, then like life isn't really going to have a whole lot of meaning for you. So that emphasis has been really important, I think, to me.
Okay, well, we want to shift to the audience in just a minute, but I didn't want to lose that question about, and maybe this panel in particular, you know, about sustainability and, you know, how you sustain yourself, what motivates you when there isn't a large group around you, and that sort of thing, and building off of Whitney's point about taking care of yourself and taking care of each other. I don't know if people want to speak to their personal reflections about activism. I just wanted to add one thing personally. I mean, partly, I mean, Asha's not here, but partly what Dave said. I mean, I do feel, you know, just enormously grateful and gratified and very proud of, you know, of Asha and the work that she's done, but also she's kind of brought me, I don't mean to claim you, I don't mean to be maternal, but I mean, I just have met such wonderful young people through that activism who have allowed me to be a part of their, you know, their circle, and so that's really gratifying. I think even whatever sacrifices we've made, I'm sure our activism, not just in '85, but making a choice to live one's life a certain way with the inconveniences, is also just the most gratifying for me. You know, it's, I'm not a religious person in that sense, so it's what I believe in, it's what gives my life meaning, and so like what could be more rewarding, you know, than that. So even when there's risks and inconveniences, that's what, you know, I'm speaking for myself, but I think I speak for other people too. That's what gives us, that's what sustains me. So anyway, so I don't know if other people want to say things about sustainability and balance and community. Are you doing the BYP thing? Mm-hmm. Do you do? So BYP, Black Youth Project 100, is another group that's been very active around mass incarceration and Ferguson and so forth. And they have a wonderful Assata Shakur quote that they say at the end of every meeting. You want to say it? Which speaks to this question.
Yes, sure.
We have a duty.
So it goes, it is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. And that's how we sort of close out every meeting that we have together, with that energy kind of like really up, because, you know, this work is really exhausting sometimes, and being in community with people, not just, you know, intellectually, but also kind of like physically too, like with your body itself, is a really sustaining thing, a really sustaining part of the work, I think.
Mm-hmm. Either end.
I think something else that we think about a lot and is like an ongoing question is just understanding that like how we exist in our community of activists is in itself like an extension of our politics. So when we're talking about what could be understood as like purely political, understanding that that's also personal and like is affected by like the bodies that we live in, like Kimani was saying. And so we're always trying to think of ways that we can, I guess, like reconcile and manage the multiple identities that we have as students, as people coming from different backgrounds, and understanding that like the activism that we do is like really important, but that we also have to take care of our own well-being. But I think, yeah, we've been thinking a lot, I think especially this year, because we've kind of gotten a lot bigger, and now we have more than just a lot of like seniors. We have kind of like, we're trying to bring younger people in as some people graduate, and like we're thinking a lot about how, as a radical space, how self-care is like necessary and a part of our politics. So
I also just think, like, speaking to the question of, like, how do you sustain yourself when you're, like, standing alone, I can't imagine, like, doing the work of Prison Divest, like, standing alone, because to me it is so much about, like, the community and all of us, like, working together, and it's really beautiful to see, like, all the solidarity in you all, that, and, like, the love that you guys have, because I think we, also, there's, like, a lot of trust within the group, and we're, like Dooney said, striving for, like, community, understanding that, like, radical politics necessitates on, like, activism being, like, a personal and about self-care and about, like, the interpersonal relationships as well.
Okay, so should I open it up for questions now? Okay, so I'm just going to open it up for questions and succinct comments from the audience, and then we'll take a few and people can respond. We have about a half hour. Yes?
So I'm going to keep this really succinct. One of the things that I try to do, you know, taking away from a group and an experience like this is a takeaway. You know, what am I going to do to carry this forward? So I'm the parent of a 12-year-old who goes to middle school that's affiliated with Columbia University, Columbia Secondary School. When we went on our tour, when she was in 5th grade, one of the questions that we asked was, well, you know, can middle schoolers go out for lunch? The school is on 123rd Street between Morningside and Amsterdam Avenue. It's in the old Columbia Teachers College building. The answer to that question was, oh no, kids can't go outside for lunch, not here, not in this neighborhood. So the school has an affiliation with Columbia. Again, it sort of perpetuates that idea that Harlem is not safe. And I think one of the takeaways that me and my daughter will do is challenge that practice as sort of a process of continuing this idea that Columbia is not a part of Harlem, that Harlem is unsafe for people in the community, and that, of course, children in that school, which is 6 to 12, should be able to experience the community beyond their walls. So really great to be here. Please continue to take care of yourself and do this wonderful work.
And fight for 15, right?
And fight for 15, that's right.
Wait for that. They're trying to record the questions, so. Right here.
There's a lot of divestment campaigns these days. A couple years ago, I was invited to a meeting where they're having a meeting about the stand your ground laws. I think people will know about those. And a lot of college campuses have divested fossil fuels. Are there these kinds of campaigns here, and how do you work with them?
There's a fossil fuel divestment campaign here, but there's also like a private prison divestment campaign at CUNY, a couple others in the country. And I think something that has also been inspirational for us is, like, with a lot of activism for Palestine, there's like a burgeoning BDS movement, which is boycotts, divestment, sanctions, and a lot of universities in Europe. So like we looked at, when we were doing research for the ACSRI, we looked into kind of the precedent for divestment from G4S at other schools, and a lot of schools in the UK and like in Norway have been successful in getting their school to end ties with G4S, because something that G4S does is like provides security on campuses. So like they train personnel who will kind of the equivalent of public safety here at Columbia being run by the NYPD basically. So that has been pretty inspirational for us, but we haven't worked specifically with Barnard Columbia Divest for Climate Justice. We know a lot of the people who are in that group, and I think when we were going through a similar process of working with the administration, and they had been working with the ACSRI before we had, and the ACSRI had rejected their proposal. So I think we strategized a little bit then, but have very different campaigns and different strategies, and I think that also a lot of what they've been able to do is kind of like mobilize like mass people and faculty, because I think that climate change isn't political in the same way that prisons are. So like they got 150 faculty members to sign their petition, and which is really awesome. But I think that we've worked on kind of like different strategies for engaging with the community. Yeah.
It's open for, I would just, if I could just take a second to say one thing that I think has been touched on, but not maybe said explicitly, and then again, you all can compose your questions while I make this comment. But we started off the earlier panel saying why South Africa, and I reiterated in this panel why prisons and why prison divestment, why private prison divestment, and Imani pointed out, private prisons are a small percentage of the prisons, right? So these activists don't think, and I think people advocating prison divestment don't think that if Columbia divests from prison, this is going to put a huge dent in mass incarceration. But the reason I think the struggle is so important is important to understand the role of mass incarceration at this moment of deindustrialization and neoliberalism, of surplus black and brown bodies that once upon a time would have been super exploited in factories and other parts of the economy, but now are warehoused in prisons. And so it's a part of what Cedric Robinson calls racial capitalism. So it brings attention to that and to the increasing criminalization of black and brown bodies in our society. But it also brings attention to the neoliberal university that we all work in, the university that's increasingly functions like a corporation that doesn't want to admit it has a conscience. And so I feel like, these young people are forcing the university to answer to its connections to a larger carceral state and the values around which it organizes. And the other thing that they do that I think is so powerful is that it's rejecting that idea that a portion of this generation of black and brown people are expendable, which is precisely what mass incarceration and a prison nation asks us to do. To say there are the best and the brightest and they might get an education, but the rest of them, they are not your cohort, they are not your generation, they're going to be locked up. And they're saying no to that. And that's a really important question that rejects a certain part of the class privilege that I think they know they have. Not all of it, you still have class privilege, but it pushes back against that attempt to write off a section of this generation. And I think that's really has to be the business that all of us concerned with social justice and social transformation have to be about. Fred Moten has this comment about broken windows, where, I know a lot of stuff he says, you don't know what he's talking about, but this idea of broken windows policing, he says that black bodies are the broken windows, right? Black bodies are couched as the threat that is being heavily, heavily policed, and I think that's what the kind of programs that Sammy and Columbia Divest are pushing back against. So that's my speech.
Yeah, well, well, what that makes me think about, though,
that's what you taught me.
What that makes me think about, though, is that is sort of, and along the line, I think Fred Moten says something similar, just about sustainability in general, right? Like the idea that, like, as we are wrestling with these concepts and doing this work, like, yes, part of the point is like the result that is going to come of it, but like a really big part of it that we really can't underestimate is that in doing that we are also building new ways of being with each other, right? And building new ways of relating to one another, and that work of understanding what we want our world to look like isn't going to happen unless, like, even in the work that we're doing to make it come about, we're engaging in those ideas and those principles in like a really practical level. So that's part of, like, I think when I think about sustainability, I think about all the ways that being able to articulate or connect myself to populations of people who the entire society wants you to write off as disposable has really fundamentally helped me reorganize the way I think about how I want to relate to people, right? And what people mean to me. And I think, like, with all these black mama feminists who we grew up on sort of telling us, like, yeah, do the work, but, like, don't let it kill you, don't give away that labor for free if you can see that you are, shouldering an unfair, like, portion of it, just like different things that show us that, like, in doing the work, the point is also learning how to do the work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I just want to ask the young people, since the system has become more sophisticated in how they oppress the rest of us, do you, the young folks, see any conflict in the way your elders fought for our liberty on your behalf times gone by? Do you see a different way of fighting the same oppression that we're all going through now? And can you list, you know, if you think it's a better way, tell us, or you have a different way? Yeah. You know what I'm talking about.
I think the way that activism works has changed a lot, just in terms of like the confines in which activists are working from, and also who should be driving the work. So a lot of times I think there is this tendency to think of activism as like mass mobilization, people in the streets, and with like you were saying, the sophisticated surveillance state, people in the streets doesn't often work for a lot of people, particularly people who are currently incarcerated, which is who should really be driving this movement. So I think we do have new technologies that also make it easier for us to be more sophisticated in our activism and in our organizing. But there's a different mode of operation. And I think like we still learn so much from all of you, and it's like, I mean, the struggle continues. It's the same problems that we're facing in a lot of ways, but like new iterations.
No.
You sure? I see. Okay, let me take the behind Josh, the young you. I don't know, what's your name? Mark. I'm just deferring to a young person who hasn't spoken. Yes.
Thank you.
You look young. I don't know how old you are.
Thank you.
Younger than us.
So my question, I guess, is for the alums or the more experienced organizers. How do you feel, especially with this notion of survival, like given that for like a lot of like Black and brown students, trans students, queer students, like integration within the university is part of your survival, but also is part of what makes you complicit, right, in perpetuating these systems. And to what extent are you able to leverage like both the resources of survival that are afforded within the university in the more expansive effort of redistribution, both like economically and in terms of like, you know, having access to things like healthcare within the university that a lot of people don't have outside of it. In what ways do you yourself like personally reconcile like having to continue within that maybe, right, for a job while at the same time remaining dedicated to the basis of the work, which is that like people are incarcerated and homeless and don't have healthcare, right, which is a reality that doesn't exist within the same context of the university. So.
Did you get?
Can I just see if I just want to make sure we
here?
Have it. Thank you. Are you asking how students can exist within the university itself and be activists working with integrity while still existing within this universe?
Or yeah, maybe more like concretely or simply put is like, how do you develop a politics that sees like complicity or appropriation from within the system as like a means of survival and also as like a radical praxis?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, we used every resource at our disposal, all right? We used the Columbia printing office. We used anything we could get our hands on that we could use, we used it without a moment's hesitation. So I would encourage you to do the same, all right? First of all, everything that's here, you all are paying for it. You're paying for every single thing that is at your disposal, whether it's through your loans, through tuition. You know, you have a right to use everything that's here. So I would just encourage you to make use of any tools that are here. So I don't know whether that's you mentioned healthcare. It's important to understand what type of system you're working in wherever you are. But that doesn't, I don't think that should impede you from making full use of what's at your disposal. Did you have anything to, I don't know if that's a full, does anybody have that was a pretty superficial answer, but do you have a full?
We didn't say Xerox with things, we said copy them.
Yeah.
Felix was
I mean,
the
you need to,
buttresses of stuff.
Right, exactly, yeah.
I mean, I'm hearing an existential question, right? Which is, how can I be part of this university community, gain benefit from it, and at the same time live and work against the complicity of it in the wider system, right? And you gotta choose your lines with that, right? I mean, I think for a lot of us, we came from sort of humble circumstances, right? And so, yes, absolutely. Part of this journey is to try and figure out how to create a life that's worth living for yourself, that includes healthcare and that includes an ability to pay for housing and you know, maybe raise a family. There's nothing wrong with that. And at the same time, you look around and you try to do the best that you can to create that life in ways that are resonant with your politics and you know, who your comrades are and that. But there are only so many social justice jobs, you know, out there, right? There are only so many jobs that are completely free of complicity, and so you do what you can, and you keep doing your work in other areas. I mean, other folks can chime in, but the days when I wake up and I'm happy to be doing what I'm doing are a blessing, right? They're not all those days, right? There are plenty of days when I wake up and you got to do stuff to pay the rent. And that's just true for all of us, or will be soon once you get out of school.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to this question that's on the table very briefly too. It is an existential question, but it's also a political question, and it's a question around sort of complicity and/or collaboration, and how do we feel about that? How do we negotiate and navigate that? And in some ways, there's no way out of that. There's no neat resolution. It's a modus operandi, though. But it is important to I mean, we live on stolen land, right? So that's an ongoing contradiction. If you work in the nonprofit industry that's driven by foundations that have their own agenda, that's a certain trap. If you work in the academy, which trains us to rank and number our students and decide, you know, who gets the goodies of a middle-class life and who won't. I mean, there's collaboration in that. If you work in government, it's infinite numbers of compromises, principled and unprincipled, that people make. So, but I don't say just leave it at that. I mean, my view of being in the academy, which is a racist and patriarchal, a heteropatriarchal institution, is to view myself as an outsider within, and to always keep that in mind. You know, that is to try to open up spaces, to try to undo the process, to try to undo the very logic of the institution. And that is, it keeps you busy. But I think keeping that in mind as you navigate the decisions you make within it is the only principled route to do. Because otherwise is to either ignore the contradiction or to try to live on the margins and outside of it, like to form a utopian community someplace and leave the rest of us to fend for ourselves, which is, which I don't think actually is the most principled solution. But it's something I think a lot about, so I'm happy to talk to you more about it in a non-definitive but rambling way. Yeah, and then we'll take a couple more questions and come back around.
Well, I think the whole issue, of privilege and what people are willing to risk, on some level is an individual decision. One of the things that happened in the blockade is not only did we have to make a decision about what sacrifice that we were going to make, but where we came from in terms of class lines within the blockade was also different. Some of us had families that could provide support for us. Some of us didn't. Some of us were able to graduate, and some people were able to go to school full-time. Some people were not. Some people had to work and go to school. So I think that the issues that you're talking about, and like you were saying earlier, to be at this institution, one of the things that we talked about is, and one of the things that I've always had issues about, first of all, I never felt like I was collaborating or complicit with Columbia University. I came here with a certain level of consciousness as a woman who had grown up on public assistance, who was in the foster care system, and I always felt that people felt that I didn't belong here. And that was something that was throughout the whole time that I was here. And we talked about the importance of making friends and other people being there for you beyond Columbia. But I think that, like, you know, Tony talked about, I mean, what happened to me and what happened to Tony was different than what happened to other people in the coalition. They threatened to take our scholarship away. I was brought up on disciplinary charges multiple times. You know, I was basically told, if you continue being an activist, we're going to take your scholarship away, and then I would have no way of staying at Columbia, which might have been a good thing, you know, but. So I think that, you know, the whole issue about class, and, you know, this went to something earlier that Barbara had talked about, where Black Lives Matter. There were we went to school with some very privileged black students, many of whom were not involved in social activism. And I would say, if you looked at the composition of the people, especially the black students on the steering committee, most of us were either from middle class or working class families. And for many of us, going to college was something that was going to be very important in terms, Whitney said, first generation college graduate. So I just think that the whole issue of class sometimes is not something that we talk about. You know, for some people, if they didn't make it through school, then you know what, they could go live with their parents, or their parents were going to support them. That wasn't true for everybody. So I just think that those are things that we also need to talk about when we're talking about activism. We don't all start off at the same boat.
Can I piggyback on what Tanaquil said?
Yeah. Where's the mic for Tony?
Let me just see a show of hands for the queue of people who wanted to make comments. Josh and Laird, and any other people we haven't had a chance to say anything.
Part of what I heard in your question, and it may just be me projecting myself onto your question, is that how do you deal with in the context of who you are as a person, if the university's systems is kind of a direct threat to you, either in terms of self-expression or being who you are, how do you do that? And first of all, I want to say that's like a really advanced question, because I really didn't think of that until I got politically involved at Columbia. And coming to the university, I didn't see the university as a threat to who I was. As I got more involved, I actually understood that better. But especially in terms of sexual orientation and gender, identity. When I came, I'm a gay man, and I wasn't an openly gay student while I was here. But in my own mind, while I was organizing, I couldn't let that part of my expression, my gay identity, be part of who I was, because I didn't feel supported by the university, and I didn't know other people's individual politics on whether or not that was safe. And your question really made me think of how isolated I was without knowing how I was isolated, and the fact that being at Columbia kind of reinforced that isolation. So I think your question is a very complicated issue, especially when you think a university threatens not necessarily the political activism or social consciousness that you develop, but it actually threatens who you are as a person. So it's a very difficult thing to get yourself through, especially in terms of 4 years of being in a place where you might not feel safe, or actually you might feel that the university actively works against you being able to be who you are and an expression of who you are.
We'll take the last couple of questions and then have people on the panel want to make, okay, Laird and then Josh. And I also want to just, okay, yeah, you were in the queue. I'm sorry, you were holding the camera, didn't see. And then I also just want, I'm not trying to put them on the spot, but Cheryl and Kathy are here from the Justice Center at Columbia, and they do a lot of work for a long time on this issue. So if you wanted to, if you want to add anything before we come to the panel, I'm going to let these three folks make comments, and then you can think about it. No pressure. Go ahead.
Well, mine's a really simple question. It should be really quick, actually, but it's related to what you guys have been talking about, and that is how developed was your sense of social justice before you applied to universities in Columbia, and how much did that influence your decision to go to Columbia? And once you were here, if you weren't conscious of it, did you ever think, well, damn it, if I'd known the university was involved in that kind of stuff, I would never have gone here. Did any of that influence you?
Okay, we're going to take the questions and then
okay.
we'll go around and let people respond to
Well, mine isn't so much a question, but just synthesizing a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of effectiveness of tactics and sustainability and larger goals. The goal of an inclusive South Africa was reflected, I think, in the mechanisms with which, and everybody knows that I find this the most fascinating thing about everything that we did in terms of the consensus decision making, and it made me realize that that was a large part of our mutual aid and our self-care. Because when you operate by consensus, everybody really counts. You can't dismiss anybody, and so we didn't care. We cared about what people were saying, what opinions they were putting on the table, and how to react to them. But we also cared about what was behind those opinions, and we had to. We all had to sustain ourselves because we couldn't do anything without everybody. And I don't know if it's certainly not a prescription, for how anyone should do activism. It's just a description of how we did it and how important it was to us. And we had people struggling with some of these existential questions that we're talking about there, and even if we didn't know the full story, most of us didn't know the full story behind everybody in the group, we still supported that person. We never asked them to, we never extracted any background detail, but we understood that we were in it as persons, not just as political entities, and so I think that was a large part of our sustainability as well. It was just a comment on that consensus decision making.
Josh, just noticing a contrast though with, I think one of the things that this generation has done that wasn't as in place in the 80s was a real sensibility about sexuality and inclusiveness of LGBTQ folks and having that be an open part. And so even sometimes when we think we're doing consensus, it's not consensus for everybody. Josh?
Just a comment, a question.
You need the
mic. I think part of the problem is that Columbia University, has gotten more sophisticated in dealing with activism. I think that they made a big mistake by letting the blockade last for 3 weeks because it got enormous publicity focused on Columbia and nationwide. What I understand from some history that the year later, there was the beginning of a blockade of Hamilton Hall focused on racism domestically. And that time, the administration swept in and arrested the people right away. And that kind of ended it. So they're using their tactics, they're following our tactics in learning. I just wondered what kind of tactics, you feel you're using and you feel are, appropriate for this time. Is a blockade outdated? Is that kind of civil disobedience no longer effective? And, we actually thought getting arrested was helpful during the 80s. Anyway, I want to ask about your tactics.
Did either of you want to say something to the Justice Center before we come to the panel?
My bad. Hello, I'm Cheryl, and I'm an outsider within. So it was interesting to hear that in the past and also right now that you see the importance of involving community. And for the young folks, my question is, how do you get community excited and engaged about participating in a Columbia divestment program or project where a good percentage of them will not even step foot on this campus?
My name is Kathy. I'm just going to comment on some of the issues of being in and out. I think that, you know, both Cheryl and I are formerly incarcerated, and when we came here to try to have an impact on consciousness about mass incarceration 5 years ago, part of the way we functioned and have functioned is to always say we're formerly incarcerated. And I think that trying to figure out how to, and then again, there's a real difference, because I can walk around this campus and kind of be insider. You know, I come from a background that is, you know, an elite background. And so I'm always conscious of the fact that sort of how I fit in is different than how Cheryl fits in. And I think it's something that we are conscious of and we talk about and we work on. And I think that's just trying to talk a little bit about this insider-outsider issue that we're talking about.
Okay, so I don't know if people want to, everyone doesn't have to say something, but if people want to say closing thoughts, remarks, or responses to, did you have a sense of social justice before Columbia, issue of consensus, tactics, how do you get community to connect with Columbia? And I think implicit in Cheryl's question is because Columbia has done so much crap to communities. Anybody want to start? Okay, and the rest of you can collect your phone.
So yeah, in terms of your question about tactics, I've been thinking when you all are talking about getting arrested and blockading Hamilton and why, I mean, Asha often likes to say that she wants to blockade Hamilton, but like why that hasn't happened. I think we've had conversations within the group about what sort of getting arrested, well, first of all, what each of us are willing to risk, but secondly, what getting arrested now means. And I think getting arrested means something different today than it did in 1980s, especially for brown and black bodies. And that's actually feeding the system instead of making a statement against it. It might be something different for like white allies to be the ones who are getting arrested. And that's something that we've also talked about, but not a strategy that we've employed yet. But just that like that particular tactic is definitely something that has like really, the context surrounding it has really changed a lot.
I think also, like, speaking to Cheryl's question about getting the community excited and stuff, I think that groups that do community organizing on campus, so I know that there was like an attempt to start this West Harlem Alliance thing working with Manhattanville, and something that I think that like our campaign and that Students Against Mass Incarceration was concerned with was that like making sure that community organizing is like led by and like always intentionally centering those most affected. So, which is why SAMI is necessarily black-led and radical and abolitionist. So I think that that is an important tactic, but also something that is ongoing because Columbia continues to be doing this violence. So is like kind of like polarizing ever more people. And that's something that we'll have to continue to adapt to.
I can say something to the question. About just like before college, and it's kind of connected to that question that I had answered a little bit earlier too. Is that like, you know, I think my parents kind of really tried always to emphasize a sense of integrity above almost everything else, but maybe more than that, like a commitment to people, right? So before I came to school, like, I don't think that I understood systems in the way that I did once I actually got here. But I just think that, like, if your guiding principle is going to be, you know, sort of a commitment to people and especially a commitment to building community, then it's sort of almost a self-correcting process, right? And so even when we're talking about something like how do we let people be their full selves in the organizing that they're coming to, right? Like, it's been sort of a constant process of being willing to put your ego to the side, right? And see, like, beyond the idea that we all have these guiding principles, in what ways am I hurting you because of these systems that, you know, have been set up, right? And being really self-reflective about the whole idea of intent versus impact. Just having an understanding that, like, no matter how hard I try, every single day I am hurting, erasing somebody, right? And I think that's a very different starting point than, oh, we're all in this together and we just want to bring change about collectively and whatever, da 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 da. So just in terms of the social justice question, I guess it depends on how you define that. But you know, yeah.
Whitney?
I did want to add one thing to, just in response to the brother's question about complicity. I think that, and I'm not sure if this is the case now within your generation, but for many folks within older generation, maybe just because there were so few students of color here, there were very few students of color. That's not to say that all of the students of color here were interested in what was going on with this, right? But here's the thing, though. Given those numbers, I always felt at a certain level that my presence was subversive. I mean, that's an indelible part of my identity. So within any institution in which I'm functioning, that's just part of what's going on in my mind. Like, there's this institutional reality here that's probably oppressive, and I'm subversive. How can I, you know, I mean, ultimately, and we do tend to behave according to our definitions of who we are. And so, so I think that's maybe a better response. If the question was, what was it that, or how did you feel about being here or existing within this reality, that sense of identity was a guiding principle, I think. And it was helpful, really, or it's been helpful. And then, yeah, I think that was it. That's it. Pretty much. Thank you.
Okay. So I just want to close and thank people. It's a little after 5. We do have a reception down. Is somebody here from Sam? Oh, you'll direct us or point us in the right direction to get to that after?
I've gotten lost twice today already.
You got lost? We're in your house, brother. Anyway, can you help me? It's on the 6th floor. Where is it?
I'm sorry, it's the 7th floor. We're in Skirmahorn.
Right.
7th floor of Skirmahorn Extension.
Okay, 7th.
I'll take us. I think we'll figure it out.
Okay, great. So I just want to again thank all of you for coming out spending the afternoon with us. The panel, Danny and Tanaquil, Rob, Marcellus, Eric, Laird, Estela, Whitney, Ella, Dooney, Imani, and for people in the audience and people who contributed, Vilna and Tony, Dave, who else did I miss? Anyway, and also to thank, the videographers, to thank IRAAS again for hosting us, to thank Sammy and Columbia Divest for all the work that you do, and really, you all are the stars of the show in a sense because you're going to be fighting this fight along a lot longer than we can. So I think it's really up to us to say what can we do to support your leadership, and that we appreciate it. So thank you all for the work that you do.